Established by presidential proclamation in 2006 and renewed every year since, Jewish American Heritage Month provides an opportunity for all Americans to celebrate and draw inspiration from the contributions that Jewish Americans have made to the fabric of our nation's history and culture. My name is Rebecca DeSantis Randall, the Manager for Equity and Inclusion for the City of Frederick and a member of the Jewish community. While the United States saw its first Jewish community form in New York in 1654, Frederick has had a Jewish presence dating back to the 1740s. The Frederick Hebrew congregation was founded about 100 years later in 1840. Their first rabbi began leading the congregation in 1858, and in 1917, the then unaffiliated congregation was renamed Beth Shalom Congregation. Their original synagogue on West 2nd Street housed the congregation from 1923 to the 1980s, and then moved to their current home on North Market Street in 1984. Today, Frederick is also home to two other congregations, Reform Congregation Kol Ami of Frederick and the Chabad Jewish Center. The Jewish community in Frederick started out relatively small and has grown today to about 400 to 500 affiliated families. Although Jews in Maryland faced a number of restrictions, such as being unable to own certain land or hold public office under the Act Concerning Religion until its repeal in 1826, the small Jewish community in Frederick flourished, especially as merchants and lawyers. Prominent members of the Frederick Jewish community include David Lowenstein, who was involved in building the Francis Scott Key Hotel in 1923, as well as other business enterprises. Leo Weinberg, a lawyer, was active in organizing the Jewish community of Frederick in the early 1900s and was instrumental in the Beth Shalom Synagogue building. Dr. Morton Maurer, co-inventor of the implantable defibrillator, was raised in Frederick and has helped save thousands of lives with this and his other medical inventions. Paul Gordon, mayor of Frederick from 1990 to 1994, was a historian and lifelong resident of Frederick. Mayor Gordon and his wife Rita wrote and published The Jews Beneath the Clustered Spires to recount the history of the Jewish population in Frederick. Jessica Fitzwater, our current county executive, is also a member of the Jewish community. Frederick was also home to a National Council of Jewish Women's section that was active in community service from the 1920s to the 1970s. To learn more about the Jewish American experience in Frederick, we sat down with a panel of community leaders to discuss the vibrant history, culture, and contributions of the Jewish community. Joining us on the panel is Rabbi Jordan Hirsch, Rabbi of Beth Shalom Congregation and chaplain in the Maryland Army National Guard, currently with the 115th Military Police Battalion. Rabbi Jennifer Weiner, Rabbi of Congregation Kol Ami and former member of the United States Navy Chaplain Candidate Corps. And finally, Maryland State Senator Karen Lewis Young, representing District 3 and former City of Frederick Alderman. Thank you so much for joining us today. So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about your experience as a Jewish community member here in Frederick? What does it mean to you to be Jewish in Frederick? Would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I came to Frederick in 1996, and being Jewish today is very different than when I first came. I was a bit skeptical when I first came, and I found a lot of anti-Semitism when I first arrived, particularly in the more rural areas. But today, I think it's a very different community. I know overall there's a rise in anti-Semitism around the world, but particularly in the United States. I don't feel it as much in Frederick, especially in urban Frederick, where we have a much more diverse and tolerant community. But I feel like I've connected with the Jewish community on a number of levels. Some of my closest friends have been Jewish because we bonded on a number of levels. And so I think Frederick's a good place to be Jewish.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's a really beautiful place to grow up Jewish. When I first moved here from New York, some of my friends in Baltimore said, kind of derogatorily, right? Why are you moving to Frederick? There are no Jews in Frederick. But they're wrong, right? Frederick is a growing area. First of all, there have always been Jews. Paul Gordon, former mayor of Frederick. So the Jewish community actually goes back centuries here, back to the 17th century. So there have always been Jews here, but it's been a small community, and I think that's changing. We're becoming a more vibrant part of the fabric that is Frederick. I will say, look, as there is an anti-Semitic rise in this country, we have experienced that here. There have been 3 anti-Semitic attacks on this building in the synagogue here in Frederick since the summer. But when I think about what it means to be Jewish in Frederick, I always go back to the story that I read in the Frederick News Post several years ago. And I think they got it spot on, because the headline wasn't about the fact that there was a swastika drawn on the sidewalk downtown. What the article focused on was a woman on her way to work that morning who saw a swastika on the sidewalk, went into a store to buy chalk, and turned it into 4 boxes that said "No hate in Frederick." And to me, that is really the ethos of what Frederick City and Frederick County is about.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, and I'm the newbie on the panel to Frederick, being that I've only been here since July of this year. And I've found it just to be warm and embracing, and I'm so glad that I'm coming in at this time in Frederick's history. When I was being interviewed to take the position at Kolami Congregation, one of the things that they said is, we're a very diverse community, which you might not think of since we're a smaller community. And I said, well, tell me more about it. And as they did, I was just loving it more and more. The fact that the Jewish community is involved in so many aspects of Frederick itself, and also the fact that you can be Jewish and be accepted here. And it's not like someone comes up to you and says, oh, you're Jewish, and it's, so you are so-and-so, and please tell me about your background and share with me. And I've really found that a lot. We've had a lot of people come wanting to find out more about our congregation and wanting to learn about Judaism. And I think that's really a wonderful aspect of our city's population.
Absolutely, for sure. I think you all sort of hit on a topic of a warmth here and an acceptance, which I think is great. So in general, we think, being Jewish in America can mean a lot of things to everyone. And we generally think, though, that there is a common thread in the story of our families making their way to this country, often in the face of persecution at home. Can you tell us a little bit about your family story as it connects to their journey becoming Jewish American?
I'll start. I guess it's the story of my tortured past. My grandfather escaped from Eastern Europe when he was about 13 years old. The Tsar was very anti-Semitic, conscripting Jewish boys into the army at the age of 13, and they had to serve for 25 years. Well, if you're in the army for 25 years, you're not coming home and making babies. And that's how they got rid of the Jewish population. So my grandfather had his bar mitzvah, and he was smuggled out of the country the next day. One by one, all the children in his family were smuggled out of the country. And my great-grandmother came after all the children were out. My great-grandfather never made it. We heard he died during the influenza pandemic. Who knows? But a couple of years ago, I started researching the family's past because I knew my grandfather was from a small town that's today in Belarus called Deutschitz. And so I started researching Deutschitz, and here's what I found. In 1942, the Nazis came and herded 3,000 Jews, which was the total population, out of town and massacred them in a mass grave. So I dug deeper and I found what's called a martyrs list, and I found the names of the families. And sure enough, there were two Dates families. And in a way, it brought closure because I learned what I suspected and I found out what happened. On the other hand, I think it made me more determined to honor our history, our culture, our past.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. Anyone else, the story of your family becoming Jewish American?
Well, I have two very different stories. On my mother's side, they came over from Russia in the late 1800s. They needed to come over, is what I grew up being told, because of their political involvement, and that they were no longer welcome to live in the country where they were born. And so they came over like a full generation before my dad's family came over. My dad's family came over via Ellis Island. I mean, they both sides came through Ellis Island, but they came over with my grandfather still being in the Polish army, having been conscripted into it. And as my grandfather and others in the family saw the writing on the wall, trying to find sponsors, and then once family members came over, that those families and members then sponsored other family members, and they got out as many as possible, more from my grandmother's family than from my grandfather's family. My grandmother actually immigrated twice. Once was with her sister, and she was just so heartsick for my grandfather that she went back. They got married, and when he found out she was pregnant, she came back over, and my father actually didn't know his father until he was 3 years old. I have a picture from my grandfather's family where it's all the men of the family, and only 2 of them made it to America. The rest, from what we have been able to discover, died at Auschwitz. And so I grew up knowing that, being told you need to appreciate where you are and the life that you have, because so many others never had this chance. And so that's really what I've brought forward. And actually this past weekend I took the confirmation class, our 10th graders, to New York, and one of the highlights was going to Liberty Island and Ellis Island and finishing up the trip with a lot of them looking up and trying to find relatives who had come through Ellis Island, and being able to be the adult with them and asking them for the stories and sharing stories that way. And it was such a meaningful part of the trip, and that's really why I tell my story, so that others can share theirs also.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, my family story, as you might imagine, overlaps a lot. I think about my grandmother, who grew up in Tsarist Russia and fled prior to their revolution. I grew up on these stories of her as she was alone at either 9 or 12 years old. We actually don't know how old she was. There's a debate in the family the age she claimed versus my uncle remembering her saying she had to lie about her age to get on the boat. But she had, so either at 9 or 11 years old, traveled alone across continental Europe. She talks about having to hide in carts and wagons with hay as, Russians, Cossacks, Poles were throwing pitchforks into it to look for Jews trying to escape. My grandfather, his father, so my great-grandfather, I think I'm maybe a generation behind here, also forcibly conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, but that same idea, and they ended up in Poland, and I grew up with my grandfather's stories of being a child in Poland and how scary and dark it was. He used to talk about Easter being the scariest day of the year. They'd have to go into hiding because the Poles would go around looking for Jews to beat up or worse. And he always maintained that the United States for him wasn't just a beacon of freedom, but it was a country that gave him and his family refuge. And he felt later on when he went to serve for our military in World War II, that it was the greatest honor of his life to be able to fight for the country that gave him refuge. And so I grew up with that awareness that even though in some ways, anti-Semitism is here, and in some ways we exist on the margins of American society, certainly in the 50s and 60s, and to a lesser degree, but still in many ways today as well, that this is a country to be not just grateful for what I have here and the freedom that it affords me and my family, but to really hold on to that memory that this country gave something to my family that we could not have had anywhere else in the world at the time.
Well, and just to add one thing to that, I think it's the reason why those of us who either have or do serve in the military as chaplains do so, because we want to give something back to the country. And so it was, for me, it was just an honor to be able to serve as a chaplain in the United States Navy, because this country saved my family, and will forever be grateful for that.
Absolutely, and I think you all, talk about different stories that so many Jews experience. We all can talk about where our family came from, and I think that's what makes our community unique, and also one that's very reflective. We all know how we got here, and we know that there's a lot of struggles behind that. And so that sort of leads into our next sort of conversation about anti-Semitism today. We know, in the last year, in 2022, the Anti-Defamation League put out that there was 3,600 recorded anti-Semitic incidents in the country, and that's the most that they've ever tracked since 1979. How do you think that we can help combat the growing bias that we see in this country and also worldwide as well?
I think that we all need to acknowledge that we have unconscious perceptions, perhaps prejudices, stereotypes of all kinds of groups. And we need to be very conscious of that and think about what we say and be more open to understanding other people's background, journey, history. I think education and communication are so critical in understanding one another. And we have to remember the fundamental basis that this country was founded upon, that America was founded to protect diversity. People came here seeking freedom, and that has been what has made us a great democracy. And when we stray from that, we endanger that. So even if you're not willing to open your mind to other people, if you consider yourself at all a patriot, then it is your obligation to support the basic premise of our country.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think it's important to acknowledge that there are really two forms anti-Semitism, both of which are problematic, but which really require different approaches. So on the one hand, you have people who consciously and knowingly hate Jews, right? And who truly believe us somehow to control the world banks and all the other anti-Semitic tropes. There's another form of anti-Semitism, which I think is more common that we encounter in our lives, which is really the ignorance, right? Just being led through certain tropes that are in our society to think certain things and certain ways about Jews, or to use certain language without even consciously thinking about what it means. I think about, I had a girlfriend, many years ago, and her mother, who was not Jewish, once we were talking, and she was, I don't remember what we're talking about, but she talked about, she Jewed someone down, and had no conscious awareness of what she said and why it was problematic, right? So we encounter both of those, but they're two very different. They're coming from two different places and really require two different things. So I think on the one hand, programs like this, education in the schools, community programs are a great way to engage with people who just don't know any better. And I think especially in a place like Frederick, where the Jewish community is smaller, where you might not have Jewish kids in your class if you're going through high school, right? Or there might be one or two. This is a really important way to bring the awareness of Jewish Americans, Jewish Frederictonians into the forefront, to know that we're here, we're not strangers, and we don't, we're just like everyone else. And that more virulent form of actual hatred. I really think the only thing that we can do, or at least the most powerful thing, is to find opportunities, and they're going to be small, and they're not going to be there for everyone, but to find opportunities for connection. Because the only way you're really going to overcome that true form of hatred of another person is to get to know them and discover for yourself that they are not what you thought they were. Absolutely. That's harder to do.
Sure.
And I was going to say education. And I think it's that we need to start with our own youth so that they feel comfortable speaking up when something happens to them in school. One of our teenagers was telling her classmates from Temple about an incident that happened at her school to her, where no one thought anything of it, and she reported it, and the student got suspended. And all I could do was turn around to her and say, yay for you for standing up and for feeling so confident about it. And her classmates were also saying, well, you thought, did you feel uncomfortable? She's like, I was concerned for my safety because of what this other teen was saying to her, which obviously they picked up at home. Mm-hmm. So here you have peers now being able to communicate about it. And not just the Jewish peers of peer-to-peer that way, but also here's this teenager who has now helped educate someone who's not Jewish in her high school, and all those around her who saw this happen, who didn't say anything, and then heard what happened when she did report it, and who supported her through it. So I think that it's really important for us to on an internal scale, be able to help our students and our members feel comfortable and asserting who they are and feeling proud to be Jewish. And on the other hand, also opening our communities open to sharing together, to being out there in the interfaith community, and to inviting people in and sharing our rituals and our what is Judaism with them, because a lot of times it's out of ignorance.
It's also important to Yeah, I love that story of that student because it really is so powerful. And at the same time, I think of a student in my congregation who had a similar incident. Someone said something very anti-Semitic. They reported to the school. And I'm not going to mention which school it is, but it's one of our local public schools. And not only did nothing happen, but when that student, the Jewish student, said, well, I want to create a presentation about anti-Semitism and give it to one of my classes, was told by the school administration after he put together this really incredible brief presentation, no, he can't do that, because if you do that, then we have to let every other group do that. And there might be a point to that, right? But so maybe the answer is great. Let's find out who else is feeling hurt that we can have 5-minute presentations to a class, right? Instead, they shut that Jewish student down and said, no, you can't talk about anti-Semitism. And I find it hard to believe that in our public schools we're not talking about other forms of racism and bigotry, that's not a conversation there. But as we were talking before the panel, right, that in our society right now, Jews are left out of the conversations around racism, bigotry, that we don't experience that, and somehow, and that, there's a great line from that book, Jews Don't Count, where he says, Jews are a people on the margins who are not considered marginalized. And we don't get brought into those conversations, and it's a problem.
I have one other example I would like to add. When we were in our legislative session, we heard a bill about making January 27th International Holocaust Day, and that the governor must declare that, and it would be a day of mediation, contemplation, reflection. So I sit in the committee that heard the bill. And what happens is the presenter goes first, and then anyone can come testify. They have 2 minutes. Well, someone testified against the bill, and I don't think I've heard so much vitriol in the 9 sessions I've been there. He said, you don't need this bill. It has nothing to do with the United States. It belongs in West Jerusalem, and Jews are the problem, at the root of the problems all around the world. So I had 2 choices. And there were 2 other Jewish legislators there, happened to be the committee chair and the committee vice chair. One is, let it go. He only has 2 minutes. Don't give him any oxygen. Move on. Or the second is, stop him. Well, because of my upbringing, which was don't be silent when you see or hear injustice, I spoke up. And I shared the story I shared earlier, which is, I'm an American, but this is my heritage. And you just made a case for why we need this bill. And I went to talk to the chairman afterwards, and I said, I don't know how you feel about my speaking out, but I felt I had to. I felt someone had to stand up to this individual and say, you can't do that, because if we allow it to happen, it's going to continue. But if they see that we're willing to stand up and shut them down, I think we stand a better chance of arresting it and sharing with other people who are just bystanders and maybe neutral, why that's so bad. And so it was, I'm glad I did it. And I know if it ever happened again, I would do it again. But I have to say, I was so surprised in my 9 sessions in the General Assembly to see that happen now.
Sure, absolutely. You all share great sort of stories of the need to educate, the need to say something. I remember as a kid growing up in places that weren't necessarily Jewish, at some point, having the conversation of people not knowing and having to explain. And so I started in elementary school, when it was Passover, when it was Hanukkah, whatever it was, coming in and doing a little presentation for my class. There's pictures of me, with my menorah talking about it. And I think back on that it was great that I had that opportunity in a public school. Not everybody does. But that it was something that I also felt like I needed to do. And I think that sort of speaks to a bit of what probably students today are still experiencing. But a way, like you said, to combat it in the ways that we think we can. So we're here to talk about our stories because it is May, it's Jewish American Heritage Month, where we celebrate the history, culture, and contributions of Jewish Americans in our country. What would you say is a meaningful way to recognize this month? And how do you think that residents of Frederick and residents of this country can celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month?
I think we could do a better job of sharing our history, our culture. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt once said, "The fear is of the unknown." And so that is the root of a lot of prejudice and anti-Semitism. They've heard these strange stories, but we haven't done a sufficient job in saying, no, that's not who we are. This is who we are. So how do we better share our culture, our heritage, our history? Start with the food. Mm-hmm. We don't do a good enough job of, sharing the food we eat. That food is the way to everyone's heart. Encourage people to, learn a little bit more about Judaism. Watch a Jewish movie. Watch Hester Street, the story of immigration in America. Try some challah, even bagels and lox. There are just so many more ways we can celebrate our culture, but not just in the confines of our own walls, but get out more in the community and do it, or do a better job of inviting the community in. We did a good job on Holocaust Remembrance Day of bringing the community in. Let's extend that.
Yeah, I love when you went to food, because what I was thinking of with this question is less about getting to know about Judaism. One of the things I think is really nice about this idea of designating different months or different American heritages is the way to use that as an opportunity and a window to understand how our culture really is a conglomeration of cultures and traditions that span a whole variety of peoples, but that really is what makes up American culture. And it's an opportunity to think a little more deeply. So everyone knows, right, Jews and bagels, right, and you think of New York, but it's interesting to realize that bagels were actually the primary bread product of certain Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, and they're, they would go around with wagons selling bagels. They didn't look exactly the same, but thinking about that, thinking about music and film, and just on the cultural sphere of how in this month, Jewish Americans not just contributed to the economic success of the country and the, political spheres of our country, but really the fabric of what we would all identify as American culture and society and American heritage. And, those opportunities exist with, African American Heritage Month to understand not just the history, but how that history of that group or any other group has really contributed to what we would all look at and say, this is America.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think that it's very important that it says Jewish American Heritage Month and not American Jewish or American Jew. And I think that that's because we're here and this is our country, this is our community, this is our heritage also, along with all the other groups of whether it's a cultural basis or a religious basis that you join a group for. And going to the food aspect, I had a maternal uncle who used to say that they were gastronomic Jews and cultural Jews, and they were the social action and social justice branch of the family. Going back to being blacklisted for my grandfather's standing up and being brought before the committee with McCarthy because he formed teachers' unions. Why? Because it was a way of earning rights, of creating rights for individuals who didn't have a voice. And that to me is Judaism. Not, it's the food, it's the marching, and then on the other side, I have the Orthodox family that has slowly become conservative and in some parts conservative and some reform, and some have stayed Orthodox. And so that's the religious side, the observant side, and taking all of that and then combining it in our community. I think that it's really important that we recognize that when you're Jewish, you're not just one thing, and when you're involved in the community, that you're not just getting involved because you're Jewish, you're getting involved because it's part of who you are and because we're a community member. And we rely upon our heritage and our teaching and our upbringing to do that. This is American Jewish Heritage Month. And I think that that's really important to recognize that this is our country. This is something that is so close to us in our hearts.
I think the short story is we need to be proactive about making sure we have a bigger tent.
Yes. I like that. I like that a lot. So to round out our conversation, we know at the end of this month there's a significant Jewish holiday coming up that the Jewish community will be celebrating, the holiday of Shavuot, where we will be celebrating Torah, our Hebrew Bible. We will be celebrating education. We'll be eating dairy foods. That's part of Shavuot. And while it's a significant holiday on our calendar, it may not be very well known outside of the Jewish community. So could you tell us a little bit about how you'll be celebrating Shavuot this year?
I'm really excited for Shavuot. It's one of my favorite holidays, actually. So, in short, what Shavuot is, so the Torah tells us that from Passover, you should count the weeks and the days until, 7 weeks, 7 times is 49 days. The 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot, which our tradition associates with the time of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. But what I love about Shavuot is because of this counting, literally, we count every day. Today's the 25th day, right? And we count every day between Passover and Shavuot. What we do is we link those two holidays. And I always like to say, Judaism is countercultural. In America, right, the American ethos is we think about freedom and we think about what are our rights. Judaism, we talk about freedom and we ask how that informs our responsibilities and our obligations, right, to one another, to God, to community. And so, we didn't leave Egypt so we could go party in the desert and do whatever we wanted. We left Egypt so we could receive Torah at Mount Sinai, right? And so, one of the more traditional practices nowadays is what's called a tikkun leil Shavuot. The same tikkun olam. Tikkun again means a fixing. Don't need to go into the whole history of it, but the idea is you stay up all night studying Torah in anticipation of receiving Torah anew in the morning. And so we always have our tikkun here, which we love doing, a variety of different learning sessions, and of course have a whole variety of dairy treats and desserts. But it's a really beautiful tradition to stay up all night, engaged in study, and then traditionally you do the morning service as the sun is rising, and it's really beautiful.
I agree with that. I really love Shavuot, and we'll be not on Shavuot, but close to Shavuot. We'll be celebrating confirmation with our 4 confirmands, and it was really interesting because one of the questions that they asked me this past weekend was, what is it? Why are we doing this? And that's because we have a teen class. So I don't really separate out the confirmands. I teach all the teens together. And we're learning about we learned about Holocaust, we learned about Israel, we learned things that are important to them to know. And then on this past weekend, we started pulling all of that together. And in Reform Judaism, confirmation came around because Reform did away with bar bat mitzvah, with b mitzvah. But yet, the feeling was that there needed to be some sort of ritual and some sort of life cycle event to celebrate. And so confirmation came into, was born out of all of that. And then slowly but surely bar mitzvah came back in, but not bat mitzvah yet. So what happened is the boys became bar mitzvah at 13. They became children or sons of the commandments, receiving that responsibility of Torah upon themselves. And the girls were like, what about us? So they kept confirmation, and confirmation became very much for girls. And yet it was at 16, not at 13. And then because, progressive Judaism, including conservative and renewal and reconstructing and all, they started, but where's the equity in this? And so to me, Shavuot is really about equity and about the entire community receiving Torah, because that's when Reform Judaism took the step back and said, you're right. If the boys have something, then the girls, and now we say, non-binary and that's why I let the student themselves choose whether they're going to have a bar, bat, b'nai, benot, whatever, or just be mitzvah, because they are receiving Torah as themselves. That's the moment. And yet, they're also receiving it as themselves, but within the greater community. And so Shavuot is really about the community. So when the students this past weekend were like, oh, why are we doing this? And I said, you tell me. And their answers were amazing. And not only that, it led into a whole God discussion. And I hadn't planned on it going there because, and it was, but I was so grateful that it did, because that's exactly what Shavuot is about bringing in all the aspects of who you are, and really seeing yourself as written into Torah. So here, these confirmation students are really seeing that Torah is not just for their parents or others, it's also for them. And so standing on the bima, reading the 10 Commandments out of the Torah scroll and hearing it in their voices, I just get so excited about that, because that's the moment that they realize it's not just the religion of their parents. It's their religion, it's their heritage, it's their food, it's their, we ended our trip going to Zabar's because they got it. And that's also what Shavuot is all about. It's about not just receiving it, but understanding it and getting it, and it being a whole part of you. And we're taking right now during the Omer, the 49 days of counting, we're taking that journey towards Sinai. And on Shavuot, we arrive at Sinai together as a community.
Well, are you ready for a very different response to this question? So I did have a bat mitzvah in my late 50s, and I also was confirmed. But yet today, I consider myself a secular Jew, not necessarily a religious Jew, and I'm fine with that. But nevertheless, I do celebrate the holidays, but in my own way. So I look at the holidays and what are we celebrating and what's the meaning of it and how do I support it? And my understanding of Shavuot is it is a celebration of the harvest, in particular the grain harvest. So what does that mean to me in the context of what is the meaning of being a Jew? I'm going to be going to the food bank. I'm going to be donating food and clothes. I do it all year round, but during the month of May, I will make a conscious effort to do it more consistently because I want to share my harvest with those that may not have it. My other understanding is it's also a month to celebrate education, our past, our history. So every year I try to peel the onion a little bit more on my family's history. And now with the ability to do internet research, I'm discovering so much more. So I will go back and I will read stories of life growing up in Deutschitz and connect. Last year, I found through Facebook distant relatives in Canada and in Texas whose grandfather or great-grandfather were the brothers of my grandfather, and we connected. And so you always want to do these things, but you get busy. But in May, that's when I say, okay, by the end of the month of May, I will do the next chapter in my search for my history and my identity.
That's great. That's great. Well, I love that too. So much about our holidays is there's so many different ways to celebrate and find meaning in it. And there are just 3 different ways to celebrate here, a holiday that's coming up for us that's significant on our calendar.
Can I add something that I think that the Senator touched on that I think is actually really important for people to understand, especially who aren't Jewish, because it's very different, right? So we sometimes talk about the faith community, interfaith, but Judaism is not a faith. We are not a religion. We are a people. We are Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. We have a religious expression, but what binds me to other Jews is not a shared faith. It's a shared peoplehood, right? It's being part of the Jewish people, which is why, I was talking with a colleague, a Christian pastor downtown once, and they said, the idea of a Christian atheist is absurd because to define yourself as Christian is a statement of faith. But you can be 100% Jewish, fiercely Jewish, proud of being Jewish, and be atheist. And there's not necessarily, look, I'm a rabbi, I think it's better when you have a faith component, but there's not a contradiction there, right? Because we are first and foremost a people. We have a religious expression, but you can be entirely unobservant, not believe in God, never come to synagogue, not even know what Shavuot is. You're still 100% as Jewish as I am, and have the same rights as any other Jewish person to participate in a religious service if you choose to. So it's so different than the common model of when we think about religion, that we're not bound by faith, we're bound by our peoplehood.
Well, I think that's go ahead.
And that has changed a lot in my lifetime. I can remember when I moved back to my home in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and I was in banking, and one of our best customers was an Orthodox Jew. And he said to me, "You're not a real Jew," because I didn't go to synagogue every week. And that really hurt. Because of all the things you just said, I considered myself Jewish because of my family, my history, my heritage, my culture, my food.
Right. He definitely believed you were a part of the Jewish people, but there is certainly the idea of, just like, are you a patriot, right? American, or are you just a citizen?
Like I said, we need a bigger tent.
Yeah.
Yes, we definitely do.
Absolutely. Well, no, this is a great way to end our conversation because I think that brings us back absolutely to Jewish American Heritage Month. There are so many things that make us Jewish Americans, and everything that we've talked about is different for everyone. But like you said, we're all a people, and to get to know the Jewish American people is to understand that we are so very different, but that we have something that's connecting us. And that's our history and our heritage and our culture and all of these things. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. We really appreciate it. And we hope that everyone enjoys celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month. The city thanks Beth Shalom Congregation for hosting our panel. For many generations, the Jewish people's resiliency and faithfulness in the face of adversity has become a part of the American story. Unfortunately, our country has seen a rise in anti-Semitism in the form of violent attacks on synagogues and Jewish businesses, swastikas defacing cemeteries, harassment on college campuses, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories running rampant online. As our panelists shared, celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month and educating others about our community helps to confront this rise in hate and hopefully create a more tolerant and inclusive future.